In the United States, we celebrate several battles and several military victories that have molded and shaped the American spirit of patriotism, perseverance, and the overall American spirit of courage, commitment, and duty to country. And very few wars demonstrate this more than the American Revolutionary War. And you always hear about these great white heroes of the battlefield during that war. But did you know that that war would have been lost if it were not for the black troops? And you may have heard of that term before, as that was repeated throughout several wars in American history. And you may say that's a very, very tall tale, that's unbelievable, but I have this article from the US Army's own website from 11 years ago, and they're telling you that I'm absolutely correct. And as a side note, if you look at the editor's note here, they say the term African American is actually offensive and would have been offensive to the black people who were living there fighting throughout that war or living in those times. And so I find it very interesting how people criticize terms like foundational black American or Salon or freedman, and I don't get the whole criticism of freedman because freedman is a literal federal term, as we had a freedmen's bank that was ran and operated by the federal government. But the main point of this whole piece from the US Army all boils down to what I always say, and that is, when you say 1776, raise a black fist. Whenever I discuss a concept such as reparations for black people who are descendant of American slaves, I will usually have a person, usually a white person, who will ask, why should I pay for something that happened so long ago? And yeah, the person will actually admit that reparations were not paid, but that they shouldn't pay in their tax dollars because we are all Americans. Well, if that's their argument, then they've actually provided me with yet another justification for black people who descend from American slaves to receive reparations, because without black people serving during the American Revolutionary War, those same white people who like to argue against me would not have a country. But before we go back in time to the American Revolutionary War, we must first discuss the reasons why I did this video in the first place. Well, you see, a few months back, I did a video discussing the plight of current black veterans who served in the US military, and how we discovered from 2002 all the way up until 2020, black veterans had their VA claims denied at a higher rate as compared to white veterans. And there is ample evidence of discrimination against black veterans that dates far before 2002. And the reason why that video had to come first is because I want you to understand the plight of black veterans before we discuss the real reason why it is a shame and a disgrace that any black veteran is mistreated in this country, given the sacrifices that black people have made for this country during the American Revolutionary War all the way up until the current day. We always hear about the great white soldiers and the great white patriots such as Paul Revere, who warned about the British coming, or you hear about the military brilliance of George Washington and others. However, we know that the black troops and the black service members who were involved in the American Revolutionary War and even before then were pivotal in the creation of this country. And before you even get into some of the white people who were mentioned, we have to discuss the reasons why the American Revolutionary War happened in the first place. And you always hear about 1776, but you never hear about March 5th, 1770, because it was actually that date that became known as the Boston Massacre. And the racism that was involved in this is quite striking, because the very first person who took a bullet for this country was actually a black man known as Crispus Attucks, who was shot with 2 musket balls into his chest on March 5th, 1770. And those rounds were fired from British soldiers in Boston, Massachusetts. And you see, Crispus Attucks was a sailor who was a free man, and it's not clear as to how or when he gained his freedom, but it is clear that he might have used the name Michael Johnson because he wanted to protect himself from being returned to slavery, because had he used his real name around the wrong people, he might have been thrown in chains. And the fact that Crispus Attucks faced racism when he was defending the American people is also something that is quite notable. And so basically the event happened once again on March 5th, 1770, where you had an argument between a citizen who was a merchant and a British officer who was on duty at that time, because the British were occupying this country as we didn't have the American Revolutionary War yet. And so throughout that conflict, you had this British officer who took his rifle and struck an American merchant. And then that caused all the colonists in the area to come running and throwing rocks and other objects to protect that merchant. And in that crowd was Crispus Attucks and other sailors. And when Crispus Attucks arrived, the British were a little bit afraid because Crispus Attucks was a large man. In fact, he was said to be 6'2". The average man in the 18th century was about 5 feet 9 inches tall. And so if that was in the 18th century, then at the beginning of the 17th century, they were either the same size or smaller, which means that compared to the average person in this country, Crispus Attucks was a giant. And so while this British officer thought that it was okay to just gang up on this innocent merchant, Crispus Attucks was not so much of an easy target. And so instead of facing this man in hand-to-hand combat or with melee weapons, once again, those British soldiers opened fire and thus made Crispus Attucks the first American martyr. And now you would think that this man would have been revered and respected, right? But you had future US presidents such as John Adams, who was a racist who actually defended the British soldiers in a subsequent trial. And in fact, he painted those groups of patriots as, quote, a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktars, end quote. And despite the fact that these British soldiers were the aggressors and they shot America's first martyr, thanks to the testimony of John Adams, who once again will become a US president, most of the British soldiers who fired those rounds were all acquitted except for 2. And the record wasn't corrected until the 1800s. And so basically, America's first martyr was painted as an angry black man when he was just defending an American citizen, like a real patriot would. You will notice this disrespect that is given towards black Americans throughout American history, but especially during the 16th and 17th century that led up to and also began the American Revolutionary War. And now I am mentioning a lot of black service members. However, at the beginning of the war, the American rebels or the colonialists forbade any black person from serving in the colonial army. And that is despite the fact that, as I mentioned before, George Washington already said he had a problem with recruiting white people. And yet, even he was against black people serving along white service members in the colonial army and even the colonial navy for that matter. Mind you, this was all happening because these white men wanted freedom from the British crown while at the same time also owning black slaves. And so this is a point in history in which black people kind of forced change among white people through military action, and let me explain how. So many black people had joined the Loyalist Army or the British Army that George Washington and the early wave white supremacists had no choice but to integrate black soldiers into the colonial army and also the navy, because the other side was just getting so many numbers to the point where it forced these white supremacists to at least engage in self-preservation. But even after the black soldiers had loyally served the colonial army and the colonial navy, and even served as spies for the colonial army and the colonial navy, they were all eventually pushed out of the military because despite their loyal service, these people were still seen as less than human. So all the people out there who are gonna say, well, there were more black people who fought for the British than fought for America, well, excuse me, but given how the black people were treated after that war ended, and given the fact that without black people you could not have won that war, I would really take a step back before you dare open your mouth to criticize any black person on any side of that war, because you may have been fighting for your country's liberation, or you could have been with the British, but we just wanted our freedom and we didn't care which side gave it. But the fact that you had soldiers fighting for this country who just so happened to be black soldiers and also black sailors, and then those same people were mistreated and oftentimes thrown in chains and made slaves, and then to know that neither those people or their descendants received reparations should be a reason for the average person to take a step back and have an honest conversation about the origins of your country. You see, black people didn't just serve in the colonial army in America. Oh no, they were also redcoats. In fact, it is true that there were more redcoats quote black people who served under the British Crown than there were who fought in the colonial army and navy. And I already know that certain people who are listening to this video is gonna say, well, hey, doesn't that prove that black people were traitors to this country? And I would say, no, that doesn't prove it, because there were black people who were willing to fight for this country. And aside from that, the black people who defected to the British Crown were only doing so because they wanted to escape slavery. And don't get me wrong, the British have been white supremacists throughout their history. However, understandably, for a lot of black people, if you're gonna offer me freedom, I'm gonna take it. And if you tell me that my freedom is contingent upon my willingness to fight for you, well, I would rather fight than to be in chains. And I think that we can all agree that's not even a hard choice. And if you need some examples of this, well, back in 1775, the last royal governor of Virginia, whose name is Lord Dunmore, issued a proclamation that any slave that ran away from their slave masters, and if those slave masters were rebels, then they would be granted their freedom. However, there were loyalist slave owners as well, and if those slaves were to try to escape while also belonging to loyalists, well, you see, those slaves were returned back to their slave masters. And the reason why this was done is because Virginia had a lot of slave owners, some rebels and some loyalists. And if you want to weaken the rebels, well, you remove their ability to make money. And if you do that, maybe the slaves start revolting. And so what this shows you is that just like the American Civil War, many people try to tell you that war was fought to free the slaves, and that is partially true. The reason why the Union Army wanted to free the slaves is not because they love black people, because if those same Union soldiers love black people so much in their northern states, then we wouldn't see generations of sundown towns in northern states. And in fact, if you look at this map here from Tougaloo University, you will see that actually most sundown towns historically have been in the north and the west, and surprisingly not in the south. And I know that the American Civil War and the American Revolutionary War happened in different time periods, but Lord Dunmore's actions had to be highlighted because Lord Dunmore did not care about black people by granting them their freedom when they escaped from rebel slave owners. No, he only cared about going against another type of white person. And so I wanted to highlight that because Lord Dunmore and the Union Army wanted to free the slaves about as much as the American Army were just being environmentalists every time we blew up an oil depot or an oil installation. No, we would only usually do that not because we care about the environment, but because we care about hurting the other side. But back to the main point. When George Washington finally decided to let black people serve, it was in the winter of 1778, or possibly in 1777, it's not for sure. But what is sure is that the Continental Army was on its last legs. I mean, it was suffering. And since so many white men in this country decided to be cowards and not serve their country or fight for their own liberation, then and only then did George Washington get over his white supremacy and finally let black people serve. And when black service members started to get onto the battlefield, that's when things went into the favor of the rebels. And a prime example of this is the state of Rhode Island, which many people don't know had many slaves. In fact, I did a deep dive into my family's own lineage in Rhode Island, and you should really go and check out that video, because trust me, there are some things in that video that will truly surprise you, because when I found out, it shocked me, and I'm related to these people. But back to the main point, George Washington actually wanted a black regiment in Rhode Island of free black people and also slaves. And there were promises that the people who were slaves would gain their freedom, but when the war ended, we find out that this country's promises are, like my grandma said, about as trustworthy as a fox in a hen house. And what was the advantage of having black troops? Well, if you look at some of the weaponry back then, the muskets and also the bayonets, the swords and the knives, well, due to the inaccuracy of the ranged weapons such as the muskets, once again, many times it went down to melee combat or hand-to-hand combat. And once the battle went to that, well, it favored the black soldiers, because while these white men on both sides may have been soldiers, the black troops were slaves and they had to work the fields every day. And if you think about a pitchfork or a shovel or any kind of gardening tool. And think about the stabbing motions that you have to make with those same tools, coupled with the fact that many of these people were from Africa. Well, you can see just why they were so effective on the battlefield. But there was also one other advantage, and I'm going to explain this advantage, not by using a black troop who served this country, but a black troop on the other side with the British. This man's name was Colonel Ty, and he was one of the best known loyalist black soldiers in the American Revolutionary War who fought for the loyalist British side. And from 1779 up until 1780, Colonel Ty and his mostly black regiment of black soldiers, who was known as the Black Brigade in New Jersey and also in New York, went around freeing slaves and engaging in guerrilla warfare or Fabian tactics against the rebel army and also the rebel citizens. But it was best known for freeing slaves, and what Colonel Ty and others proved was that you could in fact put black soldiers on the battlefield, and those same black soldiers could be highly effective. Colonel Ty was a headache for the rebels. Both him and his 800 men went around New Jersey and New York, and they laid the smackdown upon the rebels. And so the Continental Army knew that the British were using these black troops to high degrees of effectiveness. If you want to stop this, then the way that you would do so is by using spies. And one such spy was so important that his information led to the end of the war and caused the British to surrender, which means that without this black man, every person within the United States would still be under the British crown, or at least under British governance. This hero's name is James Armistead Lafayette, and he served in the Continental Army, or the Colonial Army, during the American Revolutionary War under the direction of a French nobleman whose name is Marquis de Lafayette, who was an ally of George Washington. And so early on, it was noticed that James Armistead was a pretty good actor and he could infiltrate because he understood black people in terms of the culture back then. And so that allowed him to successfully infiltrate the British, where he would collect information that would inevitably lead to the October 19th, 1781 surrender by the British, which means that once again, without this guy, the Continental Army would have most likely lost the war, because in every conflict, whoever is the most informed or has the most information on their enemy usually wins, and the average American has no idea who this guy is, despite the fact that without him, they wouldn't have a country. And much like many other black people during that period, James Armistead Lafayette was not rewarded for saving this country. No, instead, he was made a slave at the end of the war, which means that this man, who was the most pivotal spy in the entirety of the American Revolutionary War and the Continental Army winning that war, wasn't celebrated, but instead thrown in chains. And let's not mince words here, because once again, this guy is the only reason why we have a country, because back in 1781, during the Battle of Yorktown, there was a huge incoming British garrison that was coming to crush the French and the American forces, or the Continental Army as it was called back then, or the Colonial Army. And so thanks to James Armistead, the Continental and French armies managed to set up a blockade to prevent themselves from being ambushed. And then and only then did the final victory for George Washington come, because Lord Cornwallis of the British Army surrendered. If it were not for James Armistead Lafayette giving up that information and also feeding the British false information, there would be no United States of America. But because he was a spy and not an actual soldier on the battlefield, he wasn't granted his freedom like the other black troops who served for the colonial side through the Act of 1783, which freed any slave soldiers who fought for this country. And so his freedom didn't come until 1787, when Marquis de Lafayette wrote a letter to the U.S. Congress on the behalf of James Armistead. And finally, in 1787, James Armistead gained his freedom, which means that the man who was the most pivotal spy throughout the whole war had to fight just to be treated like a human being. And that also means that he gave all, but was only spit in the face for it. And if you want to talk about disrespect, then we must discuss a man named Salem Poor. And this guy was so amazing in the American Revolutionary War that he was placed on a U.S. postage stamp. Salem Poor was a part of a regiment known as the Massachusetts Minutemen, and they were essentially the National Guard. This story involves the legendary Battle of Bunker Hill, and if you are an American viewer, you have probably heard of this battle before, but most likely don't know about the hero of that battle. In 1775, there was an assault on Boston, Massachusetts by the British. Commander Thomas Gage of the British Army arrived in Boston with about 3,000 British troops in total, while the Massachusetts Minutemen and the Continental Army only had about 2,400 people to fight with. And so this kicked off in 1775 when the British forces and the colonies were having some disagreements, and largely because America's first martyr had fallen years prior, and that was once again Crispus Attucks. And so Sir Thomas Gage ordered his forces to attack Massachusetts, but by that time some of the plans had been leaked out thanks to spies such as James Armistead Lafayette. Now, he wasn't involved here, but many times the spies that were used during the American Revolutionary War by the Continental Army just so happened to be black people. While the British and Sir Thomas Gage thought this was going to be an easy fight to win, that was not the case, because more than 1,000 militiamen from Connecticut and Massachusetts arrived to meet them. And while the British outnumbered the militiamen and also the Continental armies, that didn't mean much apparently, because for multiple days, the British Army tried to attack Boston from the north and the south, and every time they tried, they took heavy casualties. However, numbers are still numbers, and the British had superior numbers. And so when they came back for a third time, the defensive positions that were set up by the militiamen and also the Continental Army were overrun. And just when it seemed like the British Army was gonna massacre the militiamen and Continental Army, some backup arrived. And that backup were the Black Volunteers, who were a part of the 1st Andover Company, who belonged to the Massachusetts Minutemen. And that regiment was under the command of Captain James Fry. The one soldier who stood out amongst all the soldiers from 1st Andover Company was a black man named Salem Poor. However, other black soldiers stood out, and we're going to talk about them later. 1st Andover Company received heavy fire, and yet they did not run or retreat, because their job was to allow the others to retreat and draw fire from the British regular army. And instead of running away, Salem Poor would stop his own retreat and return fire at the British regular army while also pulling away his battle buddies out of danger. And legend has it that Salem Poor was the one that fired one last shot that took the life of British Army Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie as he was shouting, "Surrender, you rebels." And now you would think that Salem Poor would have been recognized for his exceptional military service, and he was recognized by his regimental commanders. In fact, he got more than 10 different letters that were written on his behalf and sent to the General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the General Court never recognized this man for his service. And that is despite the fact that Salem Poor, unlike many of his white counterparts, who General George Washington couldn't even recruit because they didn't want to serve, remained in military service throughout the entirety of the American Revolutionary War. And he would also fight in the Battle of White Plains in 1777. He also served in the Battle of Saratoga and the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. Yet this man was not recognized by his own home state, despite the fact that he had to actually purchase his own freedom because he was born into slavery, and he purchased his freedom for just 27 pounds, which in today's currency is just $35.35, which means that this former slave who fought for this country with his service standing out and him ending up on a US postage stamp wasn't even recognized for his service at the time. You had other black patriots who were present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Like, for example, you had Titus Coburn, who is rarely discussed when it comes to the American Revolutionary War patriot roles. However, we're gonna give him his flowers here, because not only was this man present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he was also present during the battle in 1776, and he was directly under General George Washington. And you will notice that overall from this screenshot from the National Park Service, that when it comes to of duty and sacrifice. This man is more of an American than a lot of the people out there waving these American flags, because he kept enlisting over and over and over again. And he would have kept going, except he unfortunately got smallpox and perished on April 14th, 1778. The next black soldier who was present at the Battle of Bunker Hill leads a very interesting story. Seymour Burr was born in West Africa, and he was made a slave at just the age of 7 years old. He was brought over to the American colonies, where he became a slave of the Burr family in Connecticut. And an interesting side note, the Burr family is related to former Vice President Aaron Burr, which shows you the legacy of slavery amongst our elected officials. The reason why Seymour Burr's story is so interesting is because he started out with the British forces. And you may be wondering, why did I go out of my way to highlight what Lord Dunmore did in Virginia? Well, that partially explains the story of Seymour Burr, because he tried to escape his American slaveholders in order to join the British after Lord Dunmore gave that proclamation. However, when he was trying to escape, he was captured and then brought back to the Burr family. This man was given a deal by the Burr family. They said that if he joined up with the Patriot cause to fight against the British, then he would be given his freedom. Seymour Burr would take that deal and he would enlist in the Continental Army, where not only was he present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but he would go on to serve alongside George Washington in 1777. And so now you understand the reason why I had to highlight what Lord Dunmore did, because otherwise you would be confused. And aside from that, the story of Seymour Burr tells the story of so many black soldiers during that time period. The last soldier that I want to discuss from the Battle of Bunker Hill is quite possibly one of the most important soldiers in American history, because the Battle of Bunker Hill was won by the British, but the fact that so many British soldiers had fallen demonstrated that the British could be resisted even if they had superior numbers and superior equipment. And the soldier that demonstrated that was Peter Salem. Peter Salem was born into slavery, and in 1775, Belknap sold Peter Salem to a man who would go on to be appointed as a major in the Continental Army, and that man was Lawson Buckminster, who would go on to free Peter Salem for the purposes of Peter Salem enlisting in the Continental Army. And it was a good thing that he picked Peter Salem to free and also allow to enlist, because Peter Salem was not only present during the Battle of Bunker Hill, he did something that would send reverberations throughout the whole world at the time. During the battle, a British major whose name is John Pitcairn was fatally wounded by a musket shot. And if you're wondering who fired that shot, well, it turned out it was the same type of soldier that General George Washington didn't want serving in the first place. It was Peter Salem. And that whole event is known as the shot heard around the world, because nobody thought that these colonialists had a chance against the British. But not only did the British sit back and celebrate a victory at Bunker Hill, where they lost the most soldiers, but one of their majors was taken out by a black soldier who was once a slave. And so now you understand the importance of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Yes, the British did win that battle, but the reason why the U.S. Army's website, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and about every state's historical society, any one of them in any state, all talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill is because that was the pivotal moment in which the Continental Army and also the Minutemen learned that you could in fact resist a larger force with smaller numbers and less sophisticated weaponry. And none of that would be possible without the shot heard around the world, without other black soldiers like Salem Poor, Titus Coburn, and Seymour Burr, whose presence might have scared the living hell out of the British, because the British were thinking that their one biggest trump card were all these black people that they were recruiting. Well, now we have our own black people, and boy, could they shoot.
ACAB, don't you step to ME. I run to your sundown towns, then turn them upside down. But some of y'all monsters like Stranger Things in the upside down. No surrender, no retreat, certified soldier. Got receipts, you can't walk with my feet. I pack nothing but steel for the heat. I'm not soft, I'm elite. Play my anthem on repeat, now sing it with me. ACAB, hating is just weak. Get off my meat, go take a seat. Came from nothing, now I'm something. Descendant of slaves, enemy slave. It's just how I was raised. Black power, temperature raised. Beautiful yet bloody days. That's why I can't be tamed. None of it was ever a game. ACAB, don't step to me, answer ancestral power through me.